Good morning and welcome to Rising. I'm Amber Duke, joined by Nomiki Konst. It's great to be here with you. First time at the desk. Very exciting.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. With less than 100 days to go before Election Day, Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump is getting real. On the money front, the Harris campaign says they've raised a whopping $310 million in July, $200 million of which was raised during the first week after she entered the race. The Harris campaign has outpaced the Trump team in the money race. According to the latest FEC filing, the Trump campaign raised less than Harris, coming in at $217.2 million between January 2023 and June 2024.
Meanwhile, the latest polling shows Harris is ahead too, but not by much. According to polling aggregate Race to the White House, a collection of 128 polls reveals that Harris has surpassed Trump as of today. Harris is polling at 47% compared to the former president's 46.9%. Meanwhile, Harris's search for her VP is coming to a close. Several contenders cleared their weekend schedules, fueling speculation. Notably, Governors Josh Shapiro and Andy Beshear canceled planned events this weekend, per Politico. Harris is holding interviews with her short list of possibilities. Another contender, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, has not made any cancellations, but apparently is truncating his visit to Indiana. Politico is reporting that the Harris campaign told them she will hold a rally with her running mate on Tuesday in Philadelphia. And NBC News reported that the vetting team has met with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, and Arizona Senator Mark Kelly.
Okay, so the race is on. I mean, we have a couple of context clues here, right? The fact that she's holding this rally in Philadelphia would suggest that Josh Shapiro is involved in some way. Mm-hmm. It could mean that he's actually the selection. It could mean that maybe he's going to give his blessing for whoever she picks. But I really like him as a pick for her. I think he helps bring in sort of the working class white vote for Kamala. I think he helps her get rid of this perception that she is too tough on energy mandates, particularly the electric vehicle mandates, and her past desire to ban fracking or to end coal jobs and things like that. But he has a problem, of course, with the progressive base, which is that he's perceived as being too pro-Israel.
Not just that, also with environment. I mean, we have to remember that not all coal, it doesn't just come down to coal jobs. Fracking is a bipartisan issue in a lot of these working class areas in the Midwest and in Pennsylvania in particular, and in Delaware and in other states along that area where there's fracking. You know, it's a bipartisan issue where people are against it. It's not about jobs in the fracking industry as they import jobs from other states. That has been proven. It's about the environment. It's about drinking water. It's about local communities rising up to fight against fracking. And it would be a reversal to move in that direction, given how much progress, even under Biden. I mean, he was against fracking. I mean, he was in 2010, came out against fracking in Delaware. So I think they have an issue with two different bases that are very important to keep the excitement up. It's a bet to trade a certain set of working class voters that might be a little bit more conservative on some issues for a base that they need excited, that we saw how that was reflected in the polls when Kamala Harris was chosen as the Democratic pick. Now, she doesn't want to lose that ground, does she, especially with the polls this close? So, I think he's an interesting pick. I'm leaning more towards he gives his blessing to excite the Pennsylvania base. But I think that they need to go with somebody a little bit more progressive when it comes to working class issues and a vision moving forward. I'm a big fan of Tim Walz. I think the internet is loving Tim Walz. He's obviously shown on television that he can bring it home and speak to all kinds of voters, not just progressive voters. And that, I believe, is what Kamala Harris needs in this situation.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into Tim Walz and his record because he has been trending, especially among progressives, I've noticed in the past couple of weeks. But on the issue of fracking, I'm just curious, like where Kamala gets off on changing her tune so shamelessly. I mean, in 2020, she said, I support banning fracking. Mm-hmm. Now she has campaign advisors running to the media to tell them that she doesn't actually support banning fracking. She's also flipped on a whole lot of other issues. I mean, in 2020, she was ranked as one of the most liberal senators to the left of Bernie Sanders, supported decriminalizing illegal immigration, supported potentially disbanding ICE, comparing them to the KKK. Mm-hmm. She said that she wanted an electric vehicle mandate. She said that she wanted to I already said decriminalizing illegal immigration, but I mean, on the border, of course, she has faced a lot of accusations that she's been soft on illegal immigration. So then you fast forward and now she's sort of trying to run at least more as a moderate. And I'm curious on your perspective on if that's a good idea, for one, politically, if anyone's going to believe that. And then two, if she risks losing this progressive base by going too far to the center.
I think that's always the calculation. I mean, welcome to politics. You campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. She's not quite governing yet, but general elections are sort of a precursor to what an administration could be like. I believe she's reversed her positions many times, even when she was running for president in 2020, because her record, of course, in California is quite different than her record in the Senate. And to be progressive in the Senate is not as much of a risk, especially from California. Am I worried about the environmental issues? Absolutely. I think the border is an ever-changing issue. As we're seeing, even border immigration is down right now. It is not what it was a year ago, 2 years ago. It's in a state like Arizona, especially if she chooses Mark Kelly. I think she'll be able to overcome those issues a little bit more. When it comes to environment, I worry about that. I think the environmental voters are large enough that they could impact this election in key states, and they're single-issue voters. When it comes to fracking in particular, I don't like this approach, but I believe that in the past, advisors to the president, especially under the Obama administration, framed it from a geopolitical stance. We want to lessen our oil dependence on Saudi Arabia and other countries. This is a battle the fracking issue is a battle geopolitically between Russia and the United States once more. So if she comes at it from that approach, she might be able to make her case a little bit more strongly. I don't agree with it, but if she wants to excuse why she's reversed her decisions, she better come up with some very good answers and very quickly.
Yeah, that's what I think what one of her fundamental problems is going to be. Is she going to go with the tune that she was wrong then, or either she's lying then or she's lying now, or maybe she actually has really evolved on these issues, which I don't think very many people will believe. But if she's going to go that route, she has to explain why she has changed so dramatically. And until then, I think that's a really healthy line of attack for the Trump campaign, is to talk about the fact that you don't really even know what Kamala is going to do if she becomes president, because she has changed her tune on these issues so many times.
Unlike Trump.
Well, I mean, this is every politician flip-flops to some extent, but I think it's a very neatly packaged narrative just because hers is so recent and because she was so vociferous about these very progressive issues that she's now turned back on. But let's go back to Tim Walz, because, I mean, you identified that he is more of an economic populist. He's very pro-labor, but I think he has a little bit of baggage on some of the perhaps more cultural issues. He was quite slow to respond to riots in 2020, which a lot of people in Minnesota were not thrilled about. He was pretty strict on COVID lockdowns. There was a lot of pandemic fraud under his administration. He wants to give driver's license to illegal immigrants, or already has rather. Said recently that he would help them by putting a ladder up on the border wall so they could climb over. He has talked about allowing men to participate in women's sports. And although not all of these are top issues for voters, immigration certainly is. And that's going to be a difficult thing for him to overcome, especially as Kamala is facing similar criticisms of her time as the quote unquote borders are.
Right. No, you're right. Absolutely. I mean, these are, when you look at the top tier issues, and again, if you're talking about exciting progressive voters, he's the guy by far. But if you're talking about winning over those voters in the Midwest that seem to be the ones that are going to impact this election, maybe just by chance that he's from Minnesota, it'll overcome these other issues. But again, you're running against the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign will not let these things down. They'll be running ads over and over and over again in these key states, and the Harris campaign needs to be prepared that whoever they pick, they're going to be putting these little minor notes on repeat over and over, because quite honestly, there's too much stuff to run against Trump and Vance at this point, and they're losing the narrative, so they're going to try to regain the narrative by focusing specifically on those key voters. And Walz probably has the best chance of winning over those voters in the Midwest, given his record on labor in particular. And I would lean into that. If I were the Harris-Walz campaign, which I hope happens, it would be labor, labor, labor all day long. Labor, labor, labor all day long. Immigration is important in those states, but labor is more important.
What do you think about J.B. Pritzker?
I think they're going to have a tough time running away from the fact that he's a billionaire. Simple as that. Might be from Illinois, might be incredibly charming. He's, popular, charming, understands politics, but he comes from a billionaire family.
So even though he's pro-labor, you think that just the perception of him being this, wealthy, pay-to-play guy would be too much?
If I were advising the Harris campaign, yes.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I know we're going to continue to follow this. I know the polls suggest Kamala's up by 1 point. Swing states, a little bit different, but we're going to keep an eye on it. A lot more to talk about here on Rising. Stay tuned. It reads like a story out of a John le Carre novel. Spies, a killer, secret messages. Those are just some of the components that brought hostages home who were being held by Vladimir Putin in Russian jails. Per reports, the turning point came in late June when a group of CIA officers sat with their Russian counterparts in an unnamed Middle Eastern capital to hammer out final details for a swap. The deal on the table: 24 prisoners sitting in jails in Russia, the US, and scattered across Europe would be up for grabs. That got both sides to yes. In the end, that secured the release of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, former Marine Paul Whelan, and 14 other Americans, Russians, and Europeans. One of the Russians freed from a German jail had been convicted of killing a Chechen separatist and had been hailed by Putin as a, quote, patriot. Under the night sky in Washington, the hostages got off the plane and ended their own chapter of their horror story in Russia. Paul Whelan had this to say.
It didn't feel real until we were flying over England. I'm a British citizen, Irish citizen, Canadian, and American. So as we came over England and I looked down, that's when it became real. We flew over Ireland, then Canada, and into America, and then I knew I was home. So getting off the plane, seeing the president, the vice president, that was nice. It was a good homecoming. So looking forward to seeing my family down here and just recuperating from 5 years, 7 months, and 5 days of just absolute nonsense by the Russian government.
Meanwhile, the intricate negotiations led to a huge victory for Biden and his administration. Taking a dig at his former opponent, Donald Trump, this is what Biden had to say.
President Trump has said repeatedly that he could have gotten the hostages out without giving anything in exchange. What do you say to that? What do you say to President Trump now? Former president.
Why didn't he do it when he was president?
Now that the dust is settling, there are some people who are critical about how the deal was struck and believe that it could actually spur Russia to take more hostages. With us now to unpack all of this is Peter Duran, an adjunct senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Set the scene for us a little bit. Obviously, it's great news that these hostages came home. There is a little bit of a discrepancy here in the swap, though, in terms of who was returned in exchange for these hostages. How much of a concern is it that this could incentivize future hostage taking?
Well, thanks for having me. Let's talk about the good news first.
Absolutely.
All Americans were delighted to see our people come home and return to American soil. And I think our hearts go out to all of the families who, for the first time in many years, are now reunited with their loved ones. These were individuals who were illegally held by the Russian government and held out as bait for a negotiation. And I think that's the difficult problem here, because we have violated the iron law of American hostage negotiation in this deal, and that is don't pay for hostages. The risk here is that we incentivize more hostages being taken in the future so that more families have to go through this pain. And that's what we should avoid.
But Peter, just a light pushback here. If that were the case, then why didn't Trump do anything to try to get these hostages back, especially since he has this quote unquote, relationship with Putin? Could it perhaps have something to do with, in the instance of the the person who was being held, in Germany? Is that because they had to deal with the German chancellor and Trump's relationship with allies around the world was much weaker and he wasn't willing to create those kinds of circumstances to have a multidimensional hostage release?
I think that's a great question. And when you go back and look at the German government's response to the Biden administration's initial request to release a convicted murderer who had assassinated someone in broad daylight in front of witnesses in the middle of Berlin. This was an individual who was a refugee in Germany, and their killer was in prison under a life sentence. And so the German government thought it was morally perilous to release someone back into Putin's custody after he had violated the sanctity of German laws. So when we look at the Trump administration versus the Biden administration, we can see that the Trump administration was reluctant to pay for hostages, whether through swaps or direct payments. Contrast that with this current big deal. Yes, it's historic, but it certainly comes at a high cost.
Right. And this is not the first time, of course, that we've had a situation like this during the Biden administration. Brittany Griner, the American basketball player, was swapped for Victor Bout, who was a Russian arms dealer known as the Merchant of Death. So clearly they are not afraid to continue to take Americans at this point. When we're looking at the mindset of Vladimir Putin in terms of these trades, it seems like he is not even willing to negotiate unless he feels like he's going to get some kind of lopsided victory. Right. So what is the right approach here, if not to incentivize the hostage taking, but also while recognizing that Putin might not even come to the table unless he feels like he's going to get something better than what the U.S. is getting back?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Remember, Vladimir Putin has a very specific negotiating philosophy. It is zero sum, and that philosophy is I win, you lose. If I succeed, you must get the worst part of this deal. The reason Putin agreed to this swap, this exchange, is because he believed that he got a better deal than what he was giving up, than what the Americans were giving. So we have to be very cautious here. And remember, Vladimir Putin perceives an element of weakness in this swap, and he has pounced. Also remember, he tried to exchange, he tried to return that Merchant of Death you mentioned, Victor Bout, under the Trump administration, and Trump said no to the deal. Yes, it's terrible that an innocent individual, in this case Paul Whelan or Brittany Griner, had to remain in illegal custody in Russia. But again, you cannot pay for hostages, otherwise you create an incentive for more families to suffer this pain. And that's why Evan Gershkovich was taken hostage. 4 months after swapping for Victor Bout, Vladimir Putin gave back Brittany Griner, and yet then he took another hostage. So this cycle will continue until we close this bazaar for hostage negotiation and trading.
It seems like this is somewhat a PR stunt for him, and even with Donald Trump, his unwillingness to negotiate was a strongman play, and they're two strongmen playing off of each other. But behind the scenes, there must be something much more complex. I mean, without speculating, obviously we were not in the room between the negotiations, but is there a chance that whatever intelligence these spies that we've released and criminals that we've released back to Russia, would they have information that just may already be in the hands of Russia? Like, there's nothing that we're losing here in terms of incredible intelligence that could put us at risk as a country.
Yeah, that's correct. Remember, back during the Cold War, we did swap spy for spy. That's a typical pattern that has been established. That's different than swapping innocent individuals, innocent American citizens, for spies and convicted murderers. Also remember, this is a political coup for Vladimir Putin. He is a former Russian spy himself, and his message back home in Russia is, look at me, I'm the leader, I return our spies from abroad. So this is a major victory for Putin, and again, it comes at a high cost for the United States.
Is there also a possibility of this having some kind of impact, or at least a signal as to where Putin stands in regards to the Ukraine war? We've seen that Zelensky has sort of walked back his assertion that anything less than restoring pre-war borders would be a major loss to Ukraine. Putin perhaps is interested in coming back to the negotiating table. Is this maybe a sign of good faith to some extent that those talks might become more real?
A lot of people in the last 24 hours have been grasping for a bigger story here in the hopes that this could be the beginning of a thaw in, say, U.S.-Russian relations, or the beginning of a détente, an easing of tensions between Moscow and Washington. Unfortunately, the facts don't bear that out. In fact, there is barely any relationship at all, and Putin is running circles around us at this point. I don't see this as an opening. If anything, I see this as one additional story and a very long trail of tears related to the taking of American hostages abroad.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how the negotiations came about? We know that Germany was involved, but there's been extensive reporting on just how complicated this was. This wasn't, as you said, there's barely a relationship, if any relationship, between Putin and the Biden administration at this point. So who does have that relationship? How do they have those conversations?
Well, we actually benefit from the Wall Street Journal's own dedicated reporting on this topic. And I would point out the original deal was designed to free Alexei Navalny. Remember,
Right.
he was the leading Russian political opposition figure. He went back to Russia in an act of bravery, you could say. He was promptly taken prisoner, and he died in February in a Siberian jail. That destroyed a lot of the planning and preparation for this deal that has been in the works for many months, if not more, over a year. The original deal was essentially to swap Putin's assassin in Germany for the freeing of Alexei Navalny. Once he died, everything got scattered, and both sides had to renegotiate the terms of this arrangement. So again, the death of Navalny was tragic for sure, and it is very sad that he was not also returned. He didn't survive Putin's prison, but the others, including additional Russian dissidents, they have been freed. That's good, but the cost is tremendous, especially since Navalny was not included in this swap.
Certainly. Well, Peter Duran, thank you so much for joining us on Rising this morning. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you very much.
The Ballerina Farm story has taken over the internet. Here's a quick recap in case you missed it. Hannah Neeleman, otherwise known as the original trad wife influencer, had a controversial feature written on her by the Sunday Times. For context, a trad wife is a woman who embraces traditional gender roles, particularly in the home. In the Sunday Times feature, the author asked if Neeleman was exhibiting, quote, the ultimate act of empowerment or the ultimate demonstration of oppression. In another paragraph, the author writes Neeleman's husband, quote, wanted to live in the great western wilds, so they did. He wanted to farm, so they do. The only space earmarked to be Neeleman's own ended up becoming the kids' schoolroom. And then, in another paragraph, the author writes, I can't, it seems, get an answer out of Neeleman without her being corrected, interrupted, or answered for by either her husband or a child.
After the article blew up into a social media debate over whether the piece was fair, Neeleman responded herself with this video. Let's watch.
A couple of weeks ago, we had a reporter come into our home to learn more about our family and business. We thought the interview went really well, very similar to the dozens of interviews we had done in recent memory. We were taken back, however, when we saw the printed article, which shocked us and shocked the world by being an attack on our family and my marriage, portraying me as oppressed, with my husband being the culprit. This couldn't be further from the truth. Nothing we said in the interview implied this conclusion, which leads me to believe the angle taken was predetermined. For Daniel and I, our priority in life is God and family. Everything else comes second. The greatest day of my life was when Daniel and I were married 13 years ago. Together we have built a business from scratch. We've brought 8 children into this world and have prioritized our marriage all along the way. We are co-parents, co-CEOs, co-diaper changers, kitchen cleaners, and decision makers. We are one. And I love him more today than I did 13 years ago.
All right, so there you have it, her official response. And the author of the original Times feature has written a follow-up piece talking about the backlash and debate that has ensued from her profile. I want to start by getting your thoughts because this is our first time hosting together. I don't know how you feel about this. Do you believe what she's saying in her response video?
I believe she believes what she is saying in her response video. Do I believe she understands internalized misogyny and how important it is that you're not spoken over, especially in front of a reporter? I mean, that I think, granted, I'm taking the reporter's word as true, and I do believe that there's a strict, they record. You're a reporter, You pull out a recorder, you're on a trip like this, you want to make sure everything's on the record. And also, as someone who's being interviewed, you should be doing the same thing. So if there were specific things that they did not think were true, there needs to be an open discussion about that, about reporting. I think that's a question about reporting and not about perspective. If they thought it wasn't misogynistic, that the husband was talking over her the entire time, then maybe we need to examine how we look at misogyny. And that's what I really think the story is about, is how she interprets misogyny and how she doesn't.
Well, I would be curious to know, again, if it's the reporter's interpretation that he was speaking over her, or if they were doing sort of a joint interview type of situation, because there has been audio that has been released by Ballerina Farm where the reporter described one of the incidents as her being really quiet when she talked about getting medication during one of her birthing of one of her births. And the perception that the reporter got was that she was speaking quietly because she didn't want her husband to know that she had not had a natural birth. But when you go back and look at what Ballerina Farm shared, it was that her husband had taken a phone call in the middle of the conversation and she lowered her voice so that she wasn't interrupting him, which is a very different way of describing that situation than what the reporter did. So to me, what this seems is like this woman is being accused of being oppressed. She speaks out for herself and says that she's not oppressed and she's very happy with her lifestyle. And yet we're still questioning whether or not she's oppressed because she might have internalized misogyny. Do you think that denies her agency in some ways?
No, I think she should be able to speak out. I think that's the point of this conversation, right? But she's also advocating, aside from maybe some minor disagreements over how the reporting went down, she's also advocating for this lifestyle, advocating to surrender her own agency unless it's in relationship with influencers or doing it on the terms that her husband sets. She is choosing the trad wife lifestyle, which, in my home, and I came from a Greek household, traditional wives did not listen to every single thing that their husband told them to do.
But we don't know if she listens to every single thing her husband tells her to do. This is a projection of her relationship as outsiders.
Well, she's also very active and open on social media. So some of this is also just by watching her social media and the trad wife social media, following God. Well, what does God say? I mean, how is it determined when you say we live for God, we live for religion? Well, what form of religion? Is this that the traditional biblical sense in that the woman is to respond to every single thing that the husband says?
Well, that's not what the traditional biblical sense is. I think that's a misrepresentation of Christianity. It is true that husbands are supposed to be the faith leaders of the household, but women play an equally important complementary role, and that has always been the traditional household in terms of a biblical sense. I'm a very devout Catholic, so I do this with my husband. I absolutely listen to things that he tells me to in the home, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a voice or have some agency in the relationship. But I think it's damaging to actually tell women who want to live this way that their lifestyle is a form of them accepting internalized misogyny or choosing oppression or not allowing themselves to reach their full potential. I mean, I have to say, just even as a working woman, the happiest that I am is when I make my husband a meal. There's something deeply satisfying. Right, and this is her. So, I mean, who are you, frankly, to tell her that she is not fully opting into this lifestyle with full clarity and acknowledgement of her beliefs?
Well, I think it's what she represents. Just as we critique all types of influencers out there, from the Kardashians and plastic surgeries and reality show stars, this is also a version of that. She is out there influencing to younger women. It's a little bit easier this way. Why don't you just surrender? You can take care of the kids, focus on makeup, focus on cooking and cleaning, maybe have some help. But the reality is you don't have to go out there in that tough little workforce out there. It's so difficult. You don't have to get an education. That is what she's influencing. You are striking a balance, and kudos to you. And I strike a different balance, which is I would like to live in a matriarchy where we're all just running the world all day long. And that is going to happen. But for her, she is playing a very important role in social media, when social media is impacting so many young women and so many young boys out there. And I think I'm even more concerned about the young boys and how they interpret how women should be treated and how women should play a role in the world. And you see that in social media trends where young boys are now becoming more conservative for the first time in history than previous generations since they've been recording this. And they're becoming Republicans at a faster rate, and they're taking on those more conservative gender roles. I mean, that is a choice, but it is also an influence campaign that is happening, and she just happens to be a very notable influencer.
She is. I would dispute the idea that she says that it's easier to live her lifestyle. I do consume a lot of her content. I've never heard her say that. And then I would also say that the reason her content is so popular is that it's not just men who want to return to a more traditional lifestyle, but a lot of women too. And I think we should allow them the opportunity to make that choice for themselves. themselves if that's what they want to do. I mean, we have seen women becoming unhappier every single year. We have record rates of anxiety and depression. We saw a record number of women leave the workforce during the pandemic, a lot of them expressing a desire to stay home with their children and become homemakers. I think that's totally valid. And, in terms of her influence on young women, why is her influence more damaging than someone who says your career is your end all be all, that will 100% leave you being fulfilled and happy and you don't need anything else? I mean, these are both two extremes, right?
They are, but one thing that we're keeping out is they are very wealthy. I mean, her husband is the JetBlue heir.
Sure.
So not everybody has that choice. I mean, part of the reason why you see so many women entering the workforce historically is because life has just gotten more expensive. Our generation is burdened by a tremendous amount of student loan debt. Women are now in universities at a higher rate, much higher rate than boys are. Men, I should say, going to school. We're more educated. We're getting better jobs. And part of that is just because society is more expensive. So while this fantasy seems very cute, what it is doing is it's actually hurting our economy, frankly. I mean, if men are not going to university at the rate that they have previously, and women are taking on that burden, and women are the ones who have to be more educated, get better jobs, then what are how are the men are going to take care of their wives in this trad wife lifestyle if they don't have educations and jobs?
Well, and this is actually a very good point, because I think this is why the Republican Party in particular has become more economically populist, because they have been very critical of the two-income trap, where it is more expensive to raise a, let's say, 4-person family, to raise children, for women to be able to stay home. And so I think that's a legitimate criticism. Daycare is obviously very expensive. But I don't think that the idea that it hurts the economy for women to stay home is a useful argument, because my perspective would be that I'm okay with the economy taking a hit if it means more women get to stay home and raise their children, right? I think that's a fair trade-off.
Why can't men do that?
They could.
I mean, they should be doing that. I mean, the funny thing is
allowed
now
to.
they're not educated, they're not getting the jobs, and they don't know how to take care of kids. Generally speaking, I know I'm going to get pushback on that, but the majority of men have not been conditioned to take care of the home, and that's just how our society operates. But I'm going to push back on you, because back in the Rosie the Riveter days, that was the message, is that if we want to keep our economy afloat, women, you got to get out in the workforce. And that worked until the 50s, and especially when the Christian Coalition started to take power, to go back to these traditional roles. I mean, this is how our country operated as recent as 60, 70 years ago.
Right, but that was in a very specific context of building up industrialization during World War II. And I would also say that, to your point about men staying home, men are allowed to stay home. Nobody's saying they can't. But there is a lot of research that shows, especially in the first 3 years of a child's life, that a mother's influence in the home is deeply important for their health and their development, even more so than the father. The father is more important a little bit later in the child's life. Not to say that they shouldn't be there during a child's early years, but there is a formative relationship that takes place with the mother that simply cannot be replaced by a man.
How about we have a balance? I mean, I think that is essentially, people who think that feminism is about replacing men, I think it's about balance, personally, from my perspective, that there's so many reports at this point, it's jarring about how much extra labor women put in on top of their jobs. So it's not just that you're out there getting a job, but you come home and you're doing more labor with childcare, with obviously household duties that really should be paid for that as well. So it's about balancing the household out, I believe. But in terms of how a child is raised and the psychological effect of having a mother in the home, of course that's important. And no one's saying that should be denied. We're just saying, don't surrender all of your freedoms and choices in life by responding to your billionaire heir husband and how he wants to do things and move out in the wind, the open winds, whatever that thing was called.
Yeah, I imagine she probably feels quite empowered by her lifestyle, and maybe she feels more free being able to surrender herself to her family and take care of her children. A lot of people find great purpose in that, but I think we're going to have to agree to disagree. We're
it helps
when
you have $1 billion, I got to say that.
Oh, it does help. Anything helps when you have $1 billion, but we're going to be back with more Rising after this. Journalist Katie Couric is warning Democrats they're losing the working class. Let's watch.
Yeah, and I also think two things can be true, right? You can think their behavior and their rhetoric is weird, but you can also do a better job of reaching out to disaffected voters who are non-college educated white people, I think non-college educated white men and women in particular, who feel left out. And I think Pete is really good at that. And I think he could lean into that more. And I think that there needs to be a greater connection between the working class and the Democratic Party. Because let's face it, Alyssa, the Democrats have kind of lost the working class. And it was never that way during all my years of covering politics. I mean, you had the head of the Teamsters at the RNC. You have people buying into this notion that Republicans care about dinner table issues much more than Democrats. And these narratives, I think, have become too deeply entrenched about liberal college-educated elites who are condescending, probably started with the deplorable comment that Hillary Clinton, I'm sure, regrets saying now. But I feel like they can't just give up on that voting bloc. They need to make a much stronger connection to working men and women, working class men and women.
Couric went on to say that acknowledging things like globalization, making manufacturing difficult, would go a long way. Couric added that she just wants to see Harris, quote, with a welding hat on, working with regular Joes. So she had me up until that last part because we know the optics of people who are generally seen as part of the political establishment, or maybe even corporatists going to slum it with us regular folk. Usually does not go over super well. But I think she's correct generally that, frankly, both parties need to make efforts to make inroads with working class Americans, particularly the uneducated white working class. I mean, this is a huge reason for Trump's rise in 2015, was that there were a lot of disaffected people in those groups who were struggling with the offshoring of manufacturing, who were struggling with the fentanyl crisis and the opioid crisis, and didn't really feel like they had a politician speaking for them for a very long time. And he gave voice to those concerns and talked about policies that he felt would actually help those people. And whether or not you think his first term was successful in that or not, he talked about it. And I think for a lot of people in the Democratic Party, that has been sort of an afterthought for the past decade or two.
I think for some people,
sure,
let's not ignore
everybody.
Senator Bernie Sanders at the same time in 2015 and 2016 shifted, catastrophically shifted. I'm saying that specifically for a reason. The idea that a lot of Democrats had that they were going to be these technocrats. I mean, the Obama administration was very technocratic.
Yes.
They were deregulation. They were slightly libertarian on a lot of issues. And of course, labor within our own party was very frustrated. So the rise of Bernie Sanders, the real deal when it comes to labor, in comparison to Donald Trump, who manufactured everything in China and somehow was supposedly against China and was pro-labor. I mean, there was the idea of labor, and then there's the facade of being pro-labor. And that is what I think the Harris campaign needs to really deeply understand their bones, is that there have been major fissures and fractures in the Democratic Party that, of course, blew up in 2016, blew up with the controversies and the debates over the PRO Act. And she needs to lean in more. And that won't just win her uneducated white voters, specifically male voters in the Midwest. It's going to win her voters everywhere. The more you side with working people, the more you back labor, the more you distance yourself from those tech bros who have impacted our lives in more ways than we can imagine. And now, of course, that hits the economy because the job growth rate was lower this year, or the numbers that came out today, 114,000. That also is in relationship with NASDAQ. And NASDAQ people have come out and said that this is in response to AI. Microsoft, in particular, these tech companies saying that they want to put more money in investment into AI, and how that is affecting the stock market has an impact also on the jobs report. So these conversations about technology and the Democratic Party, AI and the Democratic Party, are incredibly important because that's also what labor's listening to.
Right, and I feel like Kamala gets it insofar as she gets it from a political strategy standpoint, but I'm not sure she's fully invested. She has given a couple of platitudes out on the campaign trail so far, which is all she's really done because she's been on for 12 days and hasn't done anything unscripted, by the way. But she's talked about how they need to rebuild the middle class and the working class, but she still doesn't even have a policy platform on her website. So for me right now, it's just lip service.
Well, we have the platform committee meetings. So some of that is just because the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, hasn't had their convention yet, and that includes the platform committee meetings and the rules committee meetings, which have actually taken place. So some of that's just logistical stuff. But, Republicans I love it. Like, they don't have, policies, everything's scripted. Well, she's giving speeches with teleprompters, which is what happens. And a lot of those speeches have been her as vice president, not as Kamala Harris, the presidential nominee. But put that aside, yes, she has to lean in with labor. The Teamsters, also much more complicated. He spoke at the RNC last time. The Teamsters do have a history of flip-flopping and playing both sides. They also wanted to appear at the DNC, and that was pushed aside. But the majority of labor, let's not forget, sides with the Democratic Party. The majority of labor,
I would say the majority of union bosses side with the Democratic Party. I wouldn't say that the majority of working folks side with the Democratic Party.
I would even say the majority of members of labor, whether it's teachers union is the largest union in the country.
Public sector is a different conversation, though. I prefer to stay on private sector. Because,
of course you do.
Well, yeah.
The majority of labor is public sector.
Yeah, but public sector labor
the
unions, of course, they're friends with the Democrats because they've been giving endless giving endless campaign donations for decades, so it's a quid pro quo.
Okay, well, same thing with billionaires. They love the Republicans for the same reason. We could play this all day long. Of course, if you're a member of a union, a public sector union, and your job is protected, and you know that you have weekends, and you know that you have health care, and you have benefits and a pension because it's enshrined in how our government functions, and thank goodness, because that's what makes our country so strong and so competitive, to this day. Thank goodness. It's when we get to the private sector when you want to deregulate everything. And that's my concern about the Harris campaign, is really pushing away from the Ubers and the Lyfts, which is going to be very difficult given her record and her family's record. I mean, her brother-in-law was a lawyer for many of these tech companies, and I think still is. It's going to be a very difficult maneuver for the Harris campaign to step aside from, like you said, those donations. The Democrats have to disentangle. You can't be in bed with big tech and also in bed with labor. It just doesn't work together. So hopefully Tim Walz will fix that.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about the economy numbers that just came out for the month of July, and things really don't look great. We saw a 1% increase in the unemployment rate since last July. Mm-hmm. Job growth has slowed pretty significantly. Some economists are suggesting that we could be headed into a recession based on this massive jump. The number of long-term unemployed Americans has increased for the 5th straight month. For any incumbent, whether you count Kamala as an incumbent or not, I think effectively she is. That's not good news, especially when economy and inflation still sticks as the number one issue for voters next to immigration.
You're right. It's economy stupid. James Carville's famous line over and over and over again. And of course, Donald Trump is going to say, under his administration, the economy was great. It wasn't. He's going to blame Kamala and say she's not going to be able to rebuild her economy. We know what they're going to say. And that's where Kamala Harris needs to come in and say, we have to do everything we can to protect these jobs. There is a relationship with AI in these large tech companies. And I'm going to keep saying this over and over because this was what was reflected in NASDAQ. We had a very unstable week with NASDAQ that coincides with this jobs report. And it is directly related to large companies investing in AI and cutting in particular, low-wage workers, which are often included in these jobs reports in terms of why you see spikes. I mean, what we need is long-term jobs to keep our country stable, and she has to have a plan for that. Not just gig workers, not just fast food workers, which are being replaced by AI, not jobs that can be replaced so easily because that's going to affect our economy in the long term.
Yeah, and one last thing before we go. I mean, let's talk about the sort of equal relationship with the economy and immigration, because these are top two issues right now. We also see in these jobs report numbers that 1.2 million native-born Americans lost employment, while 1.3 million foreign-born workers found jobs. Now, I don't know the breakdown, obviously, between illegal and legal, or I guess you would say documented versus undocumented illegal immigrants. But I think this creates an additional problem for Kamala's work on the border, because not only is there a national security concern involved here, but there's also an economic concern. And I'm not sure how she's going to square her historical positions on illegal immigration with being a pro-labor president.
I don't really understand the national security argument just in general.
Well, they've caught members of ISIS within the border.
But the majority of the people coming over the border are coming to escape very difficult lives. I mean, that's a whole other conversation to have. But I also, again, the devil's in the details here. What kinds of jobs were these? Were these low-wage jobs? Were these uneducated jobs? Are these the jobs that the white workers do not want? That's the reality of the situation. Are these your Uber and Lyft delivery
But
drivers.
are they jobs that they don't want, or are they jobs they don't want under the current wages and working conditions, right?
Well, yeah, you should ask your libertarian friends.
Well, I'm not a libertarian.
But you have some libertarian friends and colleagues, of course.
I have friends on all sides of the political aisle.
If you deregulate, if we continue to deregulate at this pace, and if the Republican administrations continue to do so, and if the Democratic administrations continue to do so, you're going to have more low-wage workers that do not have workers' protections in hand. If the Republicans really want to be pro-labor, then they have to take on deregulation. That's really what's going to, if you really want to be anti-immigration, then you have to take on deregulation. Because as long as there is a need for people to fill jobs that most Americans do not want, because, I don't know, the cost of living in our country is so expensive, then you are going to have a situation in which documented and undocumented people are taking those jobs. But they're not the jobs, they're not coming for our jobs, as Donald Trump says. They're coming for a better life because many are at risk of being kidnapped, killed. There's political instability in some of these countries. I mean, we know the history of why people come across our border, and it's not an easy history. Nobody wants to leave their home. Nobody wants to trek through mountains and deserts. Nobody wants to deal with coyotes and political violence and cartel violence. Nobody wants to go through that to deliver your to-go order.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot that we could tackle on immigration, but I think we agree on the general principle that it's a good idea to increase labor protections in America and have better jobs with higher wages for American-born workers before outsourcing that work to foreign-born workers, particularly ones who are not even eligible to work in the United States. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll be back with more Rising after this.
2023 was the warmest year on record as extreme heat and climate disasters continue to rise. Some legal and scientific experts are now joining forces to pursue a new tactic, charging polluters with homicide. The Lever's senior investigative reporter, Lois Parsley, published the piece titled Taking the Climate Killers to Court and joins us now to discuss. Thank you so much, Lois, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm fascinated by this because, it's clearly not happening legislatively anytime soon. And the climate community, organizers, scientists have been raising alarms for decades about climate change. But why did it take so long to pursue some of these companies this way legally? I know that there have been lawsuits against oil companies in the past, but this seems like a very creative tactic, but is it too late?
That's a great question. And you're right, there have been civil lawsuits against fossil fuel companies in the past, but this is a new step in the effort to hold oil companies accountable for their emissions. I spoke to scientists who are behind some of the attribution research, which is helping show how emissions are causing these kinds of catastrophes, and that ability to directly pinpoint just how much emissions are contributing to a given event is one of the things that's helping enable these kinds of new litigation strategies.
So to me, frankly, this sounds nuts to say that people should be charged with homicide or accused of homicide over emissions levels. Every single person, obviously, in the country emits some level of emissions. There's a higher level for some corporations, but how are we going to draw the through line exactly from one person's death, for example, to, well, this company released the emissions at this amount in this location and therefore they're responsible? I mean, just even from a logistical standpoint, how exactly is this going to work?
It's a reasonable question, and I think one that juries will have as well. It might help to share the story of one of the families that I spoke to. I think sometimes when we talk about these things in the abstract, it's easy to get lost in statistics. But I spoke to a woman named Eliza who lives in Montreal. She had just given birth in the fall of 2020 when she got a panicked call from her brother. A storm was approaching their mother's house in southwest France, and he hadn't been able to reach their mother. All communications to this valley had been cut off. Hundreds of people were being evacuated, and neither one of them could get any official information about whether or not their mom had made it out of this flash flood. Eliza got online. She saw the social media posts of houses being swept off their foundations and got more and more worried. Her brother actually hiked up over a mountain past where the road was closed in order to try to get into the village to find out what had happened. And he eventually talked to a rescue team who told them that by the time they tried to evacuate the part of the valley where their mother lived, it was too late. Their mom was only 67 days old, and the only reason her body was found was a neighbor happened to notice wolves in the yard behind his house. Now, you might wonder how climate change is connected to this. Researchers after this storm showed that events like this are getting far more likely due to climate change. That's one type of attribution research. Others are showing exactly how much emissions contribute to things like hurricanes. It is now, surprisingly, if you haven't been following this science, very easy to say just how much emissions cause any given event. In fact, today, about half the country is suffering under excessive heat, and scientists have told us that event itself is 3 times more likely due to climate change.
And if I may follow up, we also know that these storms are getting less deadly in part due to the technology that's been made available because of fossil fuel use. So how do you offset the potential that scientists say that fossil fuel use is increasing the frequency of storms, but at the same time we know the severity has been lessened in terms of the death toll?
I think it very much depends on who you ask whether the severity is lessened. In fact, a warmer atmosphere holds more precipitation, which tends to make things like hurricanes more severe. If you're referring to adaptation, which is how we prepare for storms, that's something that we're all going to have to do more of. And that costs money, which is one of the reasons people are advocating for these kinds of lawsuits. Coming back to your earlier question, one of the most important things with these cases will be to establish the causal chain between the fossil fuel company's conduct and climate-related deaths. So that means you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that a company's emissions contributed to climate change, which is pretty easy, that those emissions caused or contributed to a climate-related disaster, and that someone died as a result. It also matters that these companies knew that their behavior was harmful all the way back into the 1960s.
There are some cases in the past, I think notably would be Stephen Donziger, who successfully was able to challenge Chevron in a case that took him 30 years to accomplish, but he was prosecuted and he was punished for taking on a big fossil fuel company. Are there concerns that taking on fossil fuel companies are going to put the legal community at risk, the activists at risk, as has happened in previous situations?
I think that's always a valid question. One of the things that legal advocates shared with me when I asked that question was that they are hoping to establish bellwether cases, which the very process, whether or not they win these cases, in the process of discovery, interesting documents may emerge from the companies themselves. In the case of big tobacco cases in the 1990s, the discovery process helped reveal really damaging for public opinion information, which seemed to swing the tide of public opinion and led to really large settlements.
Question over strategy. How do they choose where to file these lawsuits? Because we know how conservative the courts are across the country, how many judicial picks under the Trump administration were pushed forward. Is this impacting their decision on which cases to take and where to try them?
That is a great question, and I should be very clear. So far, none of these criminal homicide cases have been filed in the U.S. The first such case, an involuntary manslaughter case, was filed this spring in France. But I have spoken to experts who are advocating for similar trials to be filed here. Defense attorneys from Texas to Oregon have been speaking to the nonprofit Public Citizen, which has been advocating for trials along these lines.
And what is the status of the case in France?
The case was filed this May. It is working its way through the French court system, which is a little bit different than ours.
Do you see a pathway in Europe being a little bit more likely than the United States? Are the systems, obviously the court system, each country is different and the politics are different, but because of Europe's role in taking on climate change a little bit more seriously than, let's say, our country, do you see that there might be a better pathway?
Well, it will definitely be interesting to watch it play out. That might influence the odds of such a case being filed in the US. The court systems themselves and how the process unfolds is different enough that the step-by-step process looks quite different. But one of the things that again might emerge was this French case is documentation that helps provide fuel for lawyers who might be interested in pursuing a similar case in the United States. Certainly, it gives the oil companies an opportunity to make their defense. They obviously disagree that they should be held responsible for climate homicides. So it will be a first opportunity for everyone to hear the kind of arguments that come up.
I mean, clearly it's a very interesting way of profiling these stories too, and releasing more information about the companies that you wouldn't have access to. I mean, as you mentioned, just the knowledge that so many of these oil companies have in what they're doing to the environment. Obviously, we all know this at this point, but the details about that does not make a great case for them publicity-wise.
Publicity is definitely part of the picture. That has been the case for many different kinds of lawsuits, whether you're talking about big tobacco or the opioid settlements in the more recent past. And it's also an important opportunity here to ask questions and look for documentation about things that show the oil company's intention, which is a legal concept called mens rea. It's the idea that how you intended to act also matters in terms of the gravitude of your crime.
All right, Lois, thank you so much for joining us today on Rising. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
The United States recognized Venezuela's presidential candidate Edmundo Gonzalez as the winner of the country's disputed election last night and rejected Nicolas Maduro's claim to victory. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's announcement comes days after Maduro claimed to win Sunday's election. Blinken published a statement reading, "Given the overwhelming evidence, it is clear to the United States and most importantly to the Venezuelan people that Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia won the most votes in Venezuela's July 28th presidential election. We congratulate Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia on his successful campaign. Now is the time for the Venezuelan parties to begin discussions on a respectful, peaceful transition in accordance with Venezuelan electoral law."
Maduro has not provided clear evidence of his victory, and officials have failed to provide a vote count. The Gonzalez campaign says it has proof from more than 80% of the voting machines to show that he won. Joining us now to discuss is Hill staff writer who covers Latin American politics, Rafael Bernal. Thanks for joining us, Rafael. So this is unprecedented, right?
Well, I mean, it's not unprecedented in Latin American history.
Okay, fair enough.
Stealing elections was pretty commonplace, I'd say up to the 80s, throughout the 20th century. But it is unprecedented in modern Latin American history, certainly in the 21st century. The countries where this has happened previously, I mean, Honduras was going in that direction, and then it didn't quite get there. This sort of electoral fraud, I mean, and we could really call it that at this point. The evidence is pretty clear, as the Secretary of State said. It happened in Nicaragua, essentially. And Nicaragua is really just maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead of Venezuela in the transition to a full-blown dictatorship. Many say it's already there, and there's a good case to be made there. And many say, like, Venezuela, depending on how this process ends, will basically catch up to Nicaragua.
Is there concern that the United States releasing this statement, effectively getting involved in the electoral situation in Venezuela, could be seen as some sort of election interference, or perhaps comparable to past interventions in Latin America where the U.S. has possibly made situations there a lot worse? I mean, I think the historical context here matters quite a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, and the thing is, the historical context is what the Latin American left, and especially not the broader Latin American left, you know, people who just have certain economic positions, but the political Latin American left, led by, like, for instance, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they will take that historical context and they will use it to defend Maduro, despite the evidence of what he's done with this election. López Obrador already condemned Blinken's statement, saying that there's a negotiated way to get to the end of it, and saying that Maduro's allies in the region will ask for a full accounting of the election. But the reality is, given what Maduro's electoral authority already put out, we know whatever accounting they give their allies, who will probably receive that accounting and really not give it too much oversight, there's really no reason to believe anything admitted by Maduro's government at this point. So it's a trap. And I mean, I guess the United States, because of its historical role in 20th century Latin America and 19th century Latin America, is kind of can't say getting what it deserves, but just to use the expression, getting what it deserves. But that doesn't mean that Blinken's statement and the Biden administration's record, and the parallel here is the Guatemalan election that the Biden administration did a very effective job at protecting just earlier this year. The recent record doesn't reflect older historical attitudes and mistakes that the United States made in the region.
You mentioned this in an election year across Latin America, as you stated. Even in Mexico, the incoming president is Claudia Sheinbaum. Whether she's going to respond the same way, I mean, how much of Venezuela's politics right now, Maduro's strength, is based on having these allies in Latin America who are willing to play into that history? And keep in mind, of course, we are in an election year right now where Kamala Harris needs that Latino vote. And it's been many people on the left in the Latino community have been pushing back because of their inability to really communicate effectively. So because this is an election year, can you describe sort of the dynamics and how Maduro's thinking through playing off of all of these alliances he has right now versus, say, in 2 years when you have different administrations in power?
That's a great question. And I think the most likely reality, of course, no way to know until this all happens, the full aftermath of this election unveils. The reality is most of these dictatorial regimes, sort of unipersonal, very tight structures where the military, the economic power, the political power are all put into one little palace that's, basically impenetrable by the country's people. They tend not to need much from outside. I mean, you talk about North Korea, Cuba. They would be doing better if they didn't have sanctions, if they were allowed to trade. Venezuela would probably be doing relatively better, though their economic mismanagement suggests that not that much better. But they, to stay in power, which seems to be their only goal, they don't need much. Does it help them to get sort of a pass from Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia? It helps them to a certain extent, but the game, especially Mexico and Colombia are playing here, is more they're trying to show the rest of the region that they have certain independence from the United States. Mm-hmm. This isn't a charitable act toward their ally Maduro because they really believe, he's a socialist brother in arms. This is a way to maintain sort of a political independence from the United States while dealing with the United States on a number of other issues in a very routine manner, particularly in terms of trade.
Why do you think Antony Blinken, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, made this statement so quickly, so boldly, given that it is an election year, as we said, and that they do need to solidify a significant percentage of the Latino vote and the history?
I think there's a few factors. The first one is that this electoral fraud was so bald-faced that, I mean, it almost seems like out of a movie. And he had to act, and this the attitude of wait and see that the administration had been getting consistent and I think very true and real headlines that they weren't taking a position on this election where the Venezuelan opposition and most members of the Organization of American States, certainly most countries in Europe, except for Hungary, were saying like this is very clearly like an old school fraud. So he had to do that, but there was also some pressure both from Republicans and some Democrats. Senator Marco Rubio has been putting together sort of this alliance of Republicans and Democrats, and some very liberal Democrats. You had Peter Welch, Ruben Gallego, like signing on to a statement that he made early on, just calling it a fraud. And the administration, given the reality and how obvious that fraud was to everyone, and that it seems to be a bipartisan issue by all standards, that Maduro is, not legitimate. There wasn't much point for the Biden administration to sit around and try to pretend that at some point Maduro would produce the receipts.
Mm-hmm. It was just a few years ago that the former president Donald Trump recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela amid similar claims of election fraud. But during that time period of about 2 years when Guaido was tangentially in power, we saw that Maduro still controlled much of Venezuela's institutions and had all of really the hard power. So are we looking at perhaps a similar situation here where a lot of the world recognizes that the election was not legitimate, but Maduro still has his hands on all of the key levers?
I think there were a lot of lessons learned from the Guaido experience. There's a huge difference is that the opposition this time is united, that the election, it was a regular presidential election. Guaido's was a little bit more complicated. He got into power because he was the equivalent of the Speaker of the House. And in theory, the president was no longer there because he lost an election. In any case, it was a much more complicated process. This is very clear who won, who lost. The parallel that the United States will try to take is that one of Guatemala earlier this year, when the outgoing president, a pretty close Trump ally, incidentally, tried everything he could to stay in power or to arrest the president-elect, now President Bernardo Arevalo, and the United States, through legislative and executive presence, there were U.S. legislators on the ground in Guatemala for weeks, and there were top State Department officials in Guatemala for weeks, and the Guatemalans just decided they couldn't go through with their plans. That is not a tool that Blinken has in Venezuela. Like, no U.S. legislator could safely go to Caracas right now. It's very unlikely for that to happen. There's no more sanctions. There's no more, we're going to take away your visa or your relatives' visas. That happened a long time ago in Venezuela. So there are some parallels, but it's going to be, I don't foresee a moment where Gonzalez sort of takes office and is recognized by the international community and sort of this pretend presidency that Guaido had, because it might be harder to deal with Maduro, and he's a reality. He's there. You have to deal with him one way or the other. If you have that institutional obstacle and you're pretending that a guy who's not president, who's not functionally president, maybe should be president but isn't, he won't have any power to deal with the United States in the name of the actual Venezuelan state.
All right, Rafael, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you helping us break all of this down. More rising after this.
All eyes are on Olympic boxing today as another boxer who has previously failed a gender eligibility test won her first match in the women's 57-kilogram category. Taiwan's Lin Yuting, a two-time world champion, faced off against Uzbekistan's Sitora Turdibekova, who was in tears after their loss. At the World Championships last year, Yuting failed the International Boxing Association's gender eligibility test. Yesterday, the internet blew up after Algerian fighter Imani Khelif won her match against Italy's Angela Carini, who quit just 46 seconds into their fight. But the International Olympic Committee has repeatedly defended the two boxers' right to compete. And after the controversy erupted yesterday, the IOC released a statement, quote, saying, we have seen in reports misleading information about 2 female athletes competing at the Olympic Games Paris 2024. The 2 athletes have been competing in international boxing competitions for many years in the women's category. These 2 athletes were the victims of a sudden and arbitrary decision by the IBA. Towards the end of the IBA World Championships in 2023, they were suddenly disqualified without any due process.
But that has not stopped some of the Twitterverse from reacting. Author J.K. Rowling wrote on X, quote, "Could any picture sum up our new men's rights movement better? The smirk of a male who knows he's protected by a misogynist sporting establishment, enjoying the distress of a woman he's just punched in the head, and whose life's ambition he's just shattered." Trump's VP pick, J.D. Vance, wrote, quote, "This is where Kamala Harris's ideas about gender lead, to a grown man pummeling a woman in a boxing match." To which journalist Aaron Rupar wrote, quote, "We're talking about a woman boxer from a country where it's illegal to be trans boxing an Italian in France, and we're blaming U.S. VP Kamala Harris. Sounds legit." So, point taken that obviously Kamala Harris is not on the IOC. She did not come up with these rules. She does support men playing in women's sports, which I think is what J.D. Vance was getting at there. But there's been a lot of misreporting, I think, on these specific boxers who are competing. What the IRA said when they were disqualified is not just that they had elevated testosterone levels, but that they also had XY chromosomes. So the suggestion is that they had some kind of rare disorder, like we would typically describe it as intersex, where they have the male chromosomes, they have the male levels of testosterone, but they haven't fully developed their primary and secondary sex characteristics. And so to me, this is a clear-cut case of unfairness. I mean, even just watching this matchup between the boxers yesterday, the one from Algeria who was accused of failing a prior gender test, this woman who bowed out of the fight after 46 seconds said, "I've never felt a punch as hard as that." And that's the fundamental problem with having men and women's sports, is that it's not just unfairness, but it's also a safety issue. We're talking about a category level advantage that men have over women, whereas typically within the categories of sex, we see comparative advantages like so-and-so is a little bit taller, so-and-so has better resources to access training. But there's a reason why Katie Ledecky, despite having the 20 fastest times ever in the 1,500-meter freestyle, is still a full minute slower than the men's record in that same event.
I mean, listen, I think this is a complicated story. Let's just start off with that there's too many different reports. There was no evidence provided, so much so that the Olympics Committee has come out and said that as well. Having chromosome conversations, intersex conversations, obviously they're very unique situations here. That is why they have these committees and they take them case by case. I think what is unfair about this situation is how the internet is, and J.D. Vance in particular, is using it as an opportunity for his election, his electoral campaign, at the risk of these boxers. All of the boxers are now at risk. All of them are dealing with hatred online, especially the ones that are in question here about their identity. The amount of bullying online on top of it is putting all trans people at risk. Every single time a situation like this pops up and a right-winger wants to use it to their electoral advantage in this specific situation, it puts trans kids' lives at risk. It's not just that this is a conversation about fairness in sports. It's that it's now become a conversation about bullying a group of people who are already at increased violence, sexual violence risk, and using it as an opportunity to isolate a group of people and reduce their quality of life. I think this is an internet debate. It is not necessarily a real debate that is happening internally in the Olympics community. Maybe they're having it on the commissions, but that is why you have those commissions, to take them case by case, to look at the evidence, what evidence is real, what evidence is not, what reporting is real, what reporting is not. And they even address that in their statement, that there's a lot of misreporting out there and the internet has taken this by storm. But again, it's putting folks at risk. And we have to keep in mind the safety of the trans community when we have these conversations.
Well, it's interesting to me that we often go to this reflexive response about, well, people are bullying trans people because they don't want them to participate in women's sports and their lives are in danger because of this. I'd love to see the evidence for that. But why are we elevating the feelings of the trans community over the women whose ability to compete in a fair competition has been stripped from them, whose, in many cases, opportunities have been taken away? We've seen women who have trained their entire lives in the sport of swimming, as a perfect example in the case of Leah Thomas, because they were one rung off of the podium because a man competed in a women's sport, all of their training went to waste when they should have been in the state championship or the national championship, and they lost that opportunity because they were competing against someone who they never really had a chance to defeat.
Well, I mean, the question is whether or not you see a trans person as a woman or a man. I mean, and I think fundamentally what you're describing here is you do not see a trans person where they chose their identity, gone through gender in that situation, gone through major changes in their lives to put them on this stage in the women's category. I think this conversation is getting so exhausting because it is fundamentally just about whether or not a trans person can be seen as a woman if they identify as a woman. And that, I think, is what is being reduced in this conversation. And by saying that a woman, cannot compete with a trans person is also denying a woman her ability to be able to compete and her choices in life. I mean, I find this it's a reductionist conversation. And we're not thinking about the complexities of what's going on in these unique situations, and we're not thinking about the livelihoods of the people who are being profiled in these situations.
You're right. I do not believe that someone who takes hormones or gets sex reassignment surgery becomes a woman. That's bar none. And even if you do believe that this person is a woman because they say that they are, because they underwent some experimental medical treatment, the reality is they retain a physical advantage against women. If you go through puberty with male testosterone in your body, you have longer wingspan, you have greater lung capacity, you have greater agility, better cardiovascular ability, you have better stamina, you have greater bone density. I mean, all of these things matter in sports.
The testosterone goes down. Can you not deny that?
Okay, first of all, the testosterone does not go down below a level that's higher than the average woman, for one. And two, those things like bone density, the ability to have greater muscle mass, those don't go down just because you have a lower level of testosterone in your body. Those are irreversible parts of going through puberty as a man.
But in this situation, the boxing controversy that we're talking about, there is no evidence of that. There is no evidence that they have stated that any of these boxers were biologically men.
And unfortunately, we won't know because the IRA says that they actually ran a test and determined that both of these boxers had XY chromosomes, but the IOC doesn't do that. The
IOC did not acknowledge. The IOC said that the IRA did not have substantial evidence, and also the IOC,
But the IOC fundamentally has a process in which they don't actually look at those things. So I don't even know that they would be able to look at the evidence based on their non-discrimination statement because they changed the way that they identify people's gender for the purposes of competition back in 2021, and they explicitly say on their website that they don't look at testosterone levels anymore. They don't look at genitalia. They don't look at chromosomes. They've legally barred themselves from looking at all of those factors. And they go strictly, for the most part, based on identity and history of competition. So they don't even have a full accounting of the physical advantages that a competitor might have against someone else in the female category.
Well, what if in this situation, as I believe one of the tweets Aaron Rupar stated, you come from a country where it is not safe for you to identify as a trans athlete or as a woman, and it's based on that country's own reporting that they're receiving to the IRA.
What does that have to do with the XY chromosomes, though?
Well, why is XY chromosome the thing that determines whether or not you're trans?
It doesn't. The XY chromosomes determine whether or not you're male, not whether or not you're trans.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Like, why is that the determining factor?
Because the problem is
because if you're middle sex, it doesn't necessarily mean. But there's a full spectrum here, is what I'm trying to say.
But this is a common sort of thing that I hear from pro-trans activists, which is that because intersex exists, that means that there's not a gender binary, that male and female don't exist. But the reality with intersex is that the complication comes not from the fact that this person's not a man, but just that they don't develop the primary sex characteristics properly. It's a genetic malfunction that happens with their genitalia, not with their testosterone levels or the fact
I understand,
that
but what does that have to do with competing in sports? What does that have to do? What does being intersex or trans have to do with competing in sports against women?
It's not about being trans or intersex. It's about being a man competing in women's sports.
But if you're intersex, which is based on the XY chromosomes you're having.
Yeah, you have male chromosomes. You are a man who has a genital dysfunction.
I don't think that somebody who's intersex sees themselves that way. I don't even think doctors see them that way.
I don't care how they see themselves. I really don't.
But why is it up to you to decide and not up to, say,
it's not up to me. It's up to biology.
Why is it not up to the commission who's setting these rules, who's having these extensive debates, and when the IOC says, we do not acknowledge that,
Right. The IOC is allowed to do that, and we're allowed to criticize them and say that they are contributing to an unfair competitive environment.
But why is it that somebody online who doesn't have the same access to information suddenly knows more, J.D. Vance, in this situation, and is now putting the trans community at risk, the greater trans community?
How is he putting them at risk by
because
criticizing?
He's jumping to conclusions based on information that we don't have, based on his speculation and ginning up his base so he can win an election, raise money.
Do you think that the women who are competing in sports against men are at risk due to issues of safety?
I don't think women are competing against men in sports.
Because trans women are women?
Yes.
Okay. We obviously have a fundamental,
I think that's
insurmountable conflict here, I think. All right, we're going to leave it there. That's actually going to do it for us this week on Rising. Great, fun topic to end on, but it was great being with you.
It was really
Naomi.
fun.
Really
Thanks.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much.
All right, that's going to do it. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Have a great weekend.